Welcome everybody. My name is Jenny Dibley. I'm the convener of the Renew Sydney West branch. And this webinar tonight is a collaboration between the Sydney West branch and also the Sydney Central branch. So I'd like to welcome conveners from the Sydney Central branch, that is Marissa Pizzica and Graham Hunt. And I'd also like to send out a great thank you to Marissa, who has worked enormously, done a lot of work in terms of organising this event tonight. So I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land that I'm on, which is the Ngunnawal land. And I'm also would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians from wherever you are as well. And I'd like to acknowledge the leaders past, present and emerging. So for those of you who don't know about Renew has been around for 40 years. And some of you may have known it previously as the Alternative Technology Association. So it's a not-for-profit organisation that enables and advocates for people to live a sustainable lifestyle. And it's an amazing group really, because it works with about 250,000 people a year. And it also publishes Renew and Sanctuary magazine, which some of you may have already seen. And one of the really things that makes it very different to a lot of organisations is that there's a lot of branches across Australia. In all states in Australia, there's a branch, and there's over 11,000 members. So the role of really the branches and really the Renew in general is that it is there to educate the community so that they can gain the knowledge, the skills and the understandings to live more like sustainable lifestyle. So that's very much what our role is. It's very much about educating the community. So the number of branches are increasing currently. So I suggest that you have a look at the website, the Renew website, and you'll find out there may be a branch, in your area. So maybe have a look. Some of the activities that are coming up include, well, the branch that I'm involved with, Sydney West. One of the things that we're organising, most likely around about August, is going to visit the Solar Car Lab, which is in Western Sydney University. And we're also going to see a small house, sustainable house here, which has a rooftop garden. Now, one of the exciting things about the Solar Lab, and it's going to be an on-site tour, the Solar Car Lab, is that a couple of years ago, one of the solar cars designed and constructed by that lab won an international car race. So we had done that tour before, and it's a really excellent tour. So look out for more information about that. Some of the other things that are on, of course, is that Renew is responsible for Sustainable House Day, which is an Australian-wide event, and that will be on the 2nd of October. And we also promote sustainability events run by like-minded organisations, such as Passive House Australia, which is having an open day from the 24th to the 26th of June. So that will be really interesting. It's a little bit similar to Sustainable House Day, where people go and look at into various houses that people have created and designed to be extremely sustainable. And then the Passive House Open Day is going to be, similar vein. So I now have the pleasure of introducing our three speakers tonight. We have three speakers who are experts in the area of urban heat, and I'd like to introduce them to you now. There's Judith Brunsma from Western Sydney Regional Organisation of Councils, better known as WESROC, and Mark Siebentritt from Edge Environment. We also have Associate Professor Sebastian Pfautsch from Urban Management and Planning Studies at Western Sydney University. And so we will have all presentations. So the idea is that we'll have all the presentations first and we'll have Q&A later. And we really ask you to put your questions into Q&A and don't put them into the comments box. I know it's hard to do because I often find myself putting the questions in the comments box, but if you could put it in the Q&A box, we'd really appreciate that. So first up, we have Judith and Mark, who will outline the issues of urban heat, particularly in Western Sydney, but it's also occurring in all parts of Australia. I'm in a fairly small town just out of Canberra, and I can tell you we've just had a whole area cleared of a fairly green space. And we have a new car park, which is just bitumen and concrete, and it's a total heat island. So it's not just happening in the big cities, it's happening in other towns and as well. So it's a problem worldwide, and of course, a lot of tonight will be about what's happening across Australia. So following, they will introduce, they're going to be outlining the issues of urban heat, particularly in Western Australia, Western Sydney, as I mentioned. They'll also offer solutions and introduce the new Cool Suburbs tool, which my understanding is that a first. It is a first, and it's something that we've needed for many, many years. So Sebastian will follow, and he will talk about his research. He's doing some extensive research within the university and some of the groundbreaking projects that he's working on. So I'm going to hand you over, first of all, to Judith and Mark.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Jenny. I'm just going to share my screen now. It should come up now for everyone. Can you confirm that that's all working fine?
That's perfect, Judith.
Perfect. Great, fantastic. So again, thank you everyone for allowing us to speak today. I'm really excited to be here today. I would also like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today, and I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. And I'm speaking to you today from Darug Land. So my name is Judith Brunsma. I work for Westrock. Westrock is a membership organisation for local governments in Greater Western Sydney. And like Danny already said, I'm joined today by Mark Siebentreut from Edge Environment and Associate Professor Sebastian Pfautsch from Western Sydney University. And I will start off today by briefly talking through the issue of urban heat and extreme heat. And then Mark and Sebastian will really highlight some really practical examples of addressing heat. So without further ado, heat. So we all know that heat's of growing concern across Australia. Like Jenny said, it's not just the big cities that are facing this issue. And in fact, heat's actually been recognised as Australia's most deadly natural hazard. It's causing more fatalities than any other than all other natural hazards combined. And I guess this, I'm just showing you this slide because it shows why heat is of particular concern to Western Sydney. So the graph on the left-hand side of your screen basically shows Sydney. So the grey line there is the Sydney CBD. The orange line is about 20 kilometres from the CBD, it's Parramatta. And the red line is Penrith, about 40 kilometres west of the CBD. So what this really shows us is that, yes, the further west we go, the hotter it gets. You can see a general trend of rising temperatures, but we can also see a lot more frequent and a lot more extreme temperatures. And we've already experienced 50 degrees in Penrith, for example, a few years ago. So those rising temperatures are due to the fact that Western Sydney is naturally hotter. It's away from cooling sea breezes. We do see a lot of ongoing development, so green spaces making way for hard heat trapping services. And of course, climate change has a massive impact as well. The image on the right that you see there is basically where a vulnerability is it overlays vulnerability to heat impacts. So what you can see is that Western Sydney, there's big pockets of highly vulnerable communities, highly vulnerable to heat impacts. And when you consider that Western Sydney is home to about 2.6 million people, this image really shows the seriousness of the issue that we are dealing with. And community surveys have time and time again shown us that the far-reaching impacts of heat. A couple of examples from a 2020 survey include that 60% of our residents have trouble sleeping. Nearly 50% are actually considering moving away to a suburb that might be cooler for them. And 23% have said that extreme heat has actually affected either their or their family's physical or mental health. So again, the issue is, well, it's recognised across policy domains. We also know that there's a need for a lot more action on the ground to address this issue. Across Australia and in Western Sydney particularly, we have seen a lot of place-based research. The research done by Professor Pfautsch is an example of that. And what that research really shows us, it provides us with a finer grained understanding of heat impacts, but it also really shows the complexity of the issue. So to date, I guess a lot of focus has been on urban greening. And while that's really important, the research really clearly shows us that trees are just not going to be enough, particularly not when we're dealing with those really extreme temperatures. So I guess what we need to distinguish between is that urban heat can be mitigated to an extent, but extreme heat is actually life-threatening, and we really need to start adapting and responding to those extreme events as well. So this slide I think is quite important. To be honest, Westrock started on sort of this heat journey in about, I think, 2016, and working with a lot of our stakeholders. Initially, we were kind of going around in circles. So we're really talking about what is the issue that we're actually trying to address here. Are we trying to bring down temperatures? Are we trying to keep people safe? And we really started to recognize that climate change, urban heat and heat waves are all element of that heat challenge, but each of those elements requires a targeted approach and targeted solutions. So working with our research partners and our stakeholders, we tried to consider all those different parts of that heat problem, and we've developed this resilience approach. So what this tries to say is stepping through basically that awareness, reduce, adapt, and respond. So what that means is that we're saying we need to really understand and assess that vulnerability and the risk conditions of a place. And we also need to raise awareness and educate our communities and our decision makers on this issue. But we also need to design buildings and places to reduce average temperatures as much as we can. And we need to adapt infrastructure, homes, businesses, and so forth to ensure that people can stay comfortable and healthy and safe in those hotter conditions. And lastly, but very important as well, we need to really acknowledge that extreme heat is actually life-threatening, and we need to be prepared to support our at-risk communities and also ensure that we can respond in case of emergency. Say if it's a 50-degree day and we get large scale power outages, are we ready to respond to that? So I won't go through this slide in a lot of detail. It really basically just outlines some of the projects that Westrock's currently implementing under its Turn Down the Heat strategy. I will say that all of the work that we're doing is really a collaboration with a lot of other stakeholders, state government, local governments, our research partners, community organisations and industry. And all of the information about the projects that are listed on this slide can be found on our website if you want to know more. So today, what we really wanted to talk to you about is this project, so Cool Suburbs. But before we do so, I just very quickly wanted to show you this slide. Again, we'll talk through a couple of projects today, but I just wanted to show you that there is actually a lot of work happening on the ground. We know that there's heat refuges, cool city strategies, canopy and grading strategies and projects. We've got emergency heatwave subplans, we've got homelessness protocols. There's a lot happening in this space, but there is a lot that we can learn from each other and a lot of dots to connect here and the need to roll out some of these initiatives in a much larger scale to actually make a difference across the region and across Australia. So I will now hand over to Mark Siebentritt from Edge Environment, who will run you through the Cool Suburbs tool, which is a heat resilience rating and assessment tool. So Edge was the lead consultant in the development of the Cool Suburbs tool, and Professor Sebastian Pfautsch, who you will hear from later on, was one of the experts on the science panel that really provided the justification of the tool. So Mark, over to you.
Wonderful, and thanks for the introduction, Judith. Just a little bit of background. Edge Environment, we're an international sustainability company headquartered in Sydney, and our vision as a world run sustainable is unthinkable. And a big part of that is working out how we respond to climate change, as well as how do we manage urban heat. And I'm coming to you today or tonight for the lands of the Kaurna people, who are the traditional owners of the Adelaide Plains, and grew up spending many a summer lying on the tiles in our house in Adelaide with the sun beaming down, living through those hot summer days. So I've been very passionate about urban heat for a while, but had a really good reminder a couple of years ago when Adelaide experienced a 47.5 degree day, just of how not just inconvenient urban heat is, but also how big an impact can have on the health and well-being of our community and our families. And so this is really strong interest, this tool. I suppose what's significant about it, building on that, is that it really highlights we need to be able to transition or translate a lot of the science that's been done around urban heat Much of it's been around for a couple of decades, and turned that into a tool that can be used to help inform the way development and planning is undertaken. And that really highlights the aim of the Cool Suburbs tool, which is, first of all, it needs to be easy to use. And so the tool itself, for those of you who love playing around numbers or with numbers or jumping online, the tool is in an Excel template, so you can jump online and use it. Importantly, though, it's a rating tool. And so when we're looking at managing urban heat, there are actually quite a few, what the technical term would be, simulation tools, which have some pretty advanced physics involved with them than mathematics. But what the rating tool does, it provides a much easier and rapid way of assessing developments. And importantly, it's assessing development at multiple scales. And the steering committee behind this project, Judith and her colleagues, were really strong on the need to be able to inform the way we look at urban heat, not just at a landscape scale, but getting down to a precinct, to a neighbourhood, and then down to individual lots. So the Cool Suburbs tool really ticks many boxes. If we look at who the project team was, we're really fortunate to have a broad range of organisation and individuals coming together. So in addition to the project team, which involved WesRock, Resilient Sydney and Greater Sydney Commission, wanted to recognise the work of the consultant team. Outside of EDGE, we also had the Water Sensitive Cities Institute, Heart Consulting and Kinesis, as well as the science panel was really powerful. And we'll hear from Sebastian in a few moments. He was the lead from Western Sydney Uni, as well as we had other key researchers from around Australia from UNSW, University of Melbourne, and also Monash University. And that science panel played a really important part. That's okay, Judith, we'll go on the next slide. The science panel played a really important part because one of the biggest challenges we have right around the nation in looking at how to manage urban heat is how do we translate the existing science into a usable format. And so Sebastian, also Malcolm Eadie from the Water Sensitive Cities Institute and other colleagues did a marvellous job at looking at how to translate that science into metrics that we could use for the tool. But to develop a tool like this, we also had to engage the broad range of people. So we talked with various potential end users to understand what are their needs, how will they potentially use that tool in the future. And so we spoke with representatives of some of the biggest developers in Australia, as well as representatives from key government agencies. And then we went on to the fun part of turning it all into a tool that can be used. And we'll show you a little bit later how the tool works and where you can access it. So the tool itself is set up around 6 different categories. And Judith made a really important point before, is that while greening is really significant in how we address urban cooling, it's not the only thing to consider. And so the tool is set up around 6 different categories of what are called credits. And you'll see, and I won't read through each of these that are on the slide, but you'll see they're quite diverse. So we look at everything from an urban design perspective. So how does wind move through suburbs? How might you buffer wind movement? What's the role of street canyons? Then we get right down to individual parks and buildings. There's also another one around cool streets. So how do we consider the type of pavements that are being used? What's the role of shade from trees? So it's really quite broad and diverse. In addition to this, we also have a respond checklist. So outside of looking at these categories here, which are really around risk reduction and how do you adapt, we're also looking at what are the sort of things you can do to respond during an event. And the way the tool works is it has a weighting scheme in place. So it gives different weightings to credits depending on the scale of the site we're looking at. We'll move on the next slide, Judith. What we'll see is that the tool is designed to address each of those components of the resilience framework that Judith presented earlier on. I think this is one of the challenges often when we've looked at tools like this around Australia and internationally, is how do they tie back to a resilience-based approach? But the tool's designed to be very transparent, and you can drill into any one of the 28 credits and get a better understanding of what guidance is being provided, as well as some of the science that's being referred to. One of the questions we've been getting asked a lot is, can the tool be used outside of Western Sydney? So clearly understanding how to address urban heat in Western Sydney is really important, but Western Sydney isn't the only part of Australia or even the world that's tackling this issue. And so the tool can actually be adapted, and we're currently in discussions to look at how it can be adapted for different parts of the country. And there are 4 particular credits that would need to be changed to do that. But the remainder of the credits outside of these 4, and the 4 there you'll see relate to wind paths and other factors, the remainder of credits can be applicable to all different geographies around the country. One of the things we set out to do was to look at, well, what are the potential uses of the tool? And it's always interesting when you have one use in mind, and the more you speak with potential end users, you find out all the vast range of ways that they can consider to apply tools. And in the end, we've seen that there's a lot of different ways that councils, state government, and developers can use the tool. So everything from upfront informing development, how do you inform the design of a development, through to looking at assessment and approval. So if we're looking at approving developments, are they meeting certain conditions and requirements of the tool? And then ultimately informing policy and planning. And I think, Judith, my experience recently is that most times we go out and present the tool, we're finding new and interesting ways that people are considering it can be used, which is really exciting and suggests it's got a big future. If you're interested off the back of tonight in having a look at the tool, the best place to go is coolsuburbs.com.au. And if you go onto that site there, you'll find some information around the fact sheet. You'll be able to access the tool itself, as well as the user guide and science rationale. And I think that user guide and science rationale, while it's not the tool itself, it contains some really fascinating information around how we've drawn on the science through the support of the science reference panel to inform the development of the tool. But this is a good time to show you a little bit of an example of what you would see if you went into the tool. We decided not to go to the live version of the tool, because that can always be a little bit risky in live demonstrations like this. So we've just done some snapshots of windows for when you jump into the tool. And rest assured that Greenacre Springs is not a real place. It's just a place that we made up. So this is an example here. If you'd come into step one, you enter some basic details about the area that you want to assess. But it's really in step two where you start to provide more details about the site. So what you do is you'd select what's the region your development is in. You'd indicate, is it a greenfield site or is it brownfield? So greenfield meaning a new area where there hasn't previously been any development, or brownfield might be an existing industrial area that's getting turned into housing. You then look at the scale. And the scale goes from everything from a large precinct down to individual lots. We're also looking at the tool in the future about being able to switch on and off different credits for different planning stages. But really the tool is driven by looking at different topologies or zones and then working out what percentage of the area of those zones are present on any one individual site. So you might say, for example, that residential high density, in this case here, I can see it's entered twice. So that would be 50% of the site, 10% of the site is open space, another 10% is industrial, and then 30% is street. So you're basically training the tool up to tell it what the breakdown of your area is. And then if we click through to step three, what you're basically presented with, you can see this basic Excel approach is coming through, and there's an indication of what the credits are, and then what are the criteria that need to be met in order to get either a yes or a no. So you'll see on the right-hand side there, there's a column which says credit or criteria satisfied. And when you're in the live version of the tool, you're either saying, yes, you can meet it, or no, you can't. And that then drives the tool towards generating a score. One of the things that the science panel was really big on is that there are certain things that are mandatory in the way you set up the tool or the way you achieve points. And if you don't achieve those credits, you can't actually get a rating. So this really sets the bar through the use of this tool as to the minimum requirements we would expect to be able to give a cool suburb a score. So, you know, the point here is that we're not going to give a cool suburbs rating for a suburb that might only get 10 points out of 100. There are a minimum number of mandatory criteria that need to be assessed. But the idea is it's very user-friendly and quite clear and instructive around what you need to do to meet the various credit criteria. But just moving on the next slide, I mentioned earlier on that we also have a respond checklist. So there's various other issues that the tool considers. So you can look at, in addition to those other credits that you just gained, what are the other features you might want to consider around respond. So one of them is vulnerability mapping. So, you know, this is asking you, do you understand where the most vulnerable members of the community are located? Another part of a response to urban heat is community awareness and decision support. So how are you going about raising awareness amongst the community of the impact of urban heat and what can be done about it? So this is the respond checklist that sits at the back. Some of the key learnings out of the tool to date, and this is something which is growing at a rapid rate as we do more and more demonstrations of it. But the type of credits that are achieved are really influenced by whether you've got a brownfield or a greenfield site. The scale of development is really important to the number of credits you achieve. So are you looking at a large master plan community, or are you at an individual lot? What's the planning stage is significant, and also the area of the selected zones. So are you in an area where it's predominantly high density residential living, or are you in an area with lots of open space and low density? They can all have an impact on the scores. I mentioned before, the second point here is that the tool's geared, so you have to meet a mandatory credit requirement in order for a score to be generated. That's really important for anyone who's eager and jumps in there tonight to look at how it operates. And what's important as well is that users in the future are going to need to have enough detail about the plans of their site to be able to use the tool. So if you're sitting at this, you could use this for your own home tonight. You're just going to need to know the area of your, the outside, the private open space versus the footprint of your building. But if you're doing this for 1,000 home development, you're going to need some fairly detailed plans. To move on from there, Judith. So one of the points here is, what else can you do to support the tool and where it's headed? And it really is the first of its kind to have a rating tool such as this. So you could look at trialing the Cool Suburbs tool. That might be just out of personal interest, or it might be something that you're interested in doing from a professional or a work perspective. You can also look at leading by example at home. So one of the really neat features of the tool, and particularly that science rationale, it provides some really clear direction as to the types of design features you might want to consider. That could be things like core materials, shading. It could be about porous pavements or greater use of vegetation. And I'm sure there's some of the things that Sebastian will touch more on soon. Another point here is not forgetting that heat resilience is a human safety concern, and it's more than people being uncomfortable. There's a really strong recognition that there is a human safety dimension here. And also you can look at making submissions wherever you can. So whether it's about looking at the National Construction Code or talking with your own local government agency around how the tool can be used. So really encourage anyone who's interested in working at the tool, having a look at it or playing around with it, is jump onto coolsuburbs.com.au, download a copy of the tool and jump in there and have a play around. And we're always keen to find out more about user experience. So if you do have any other feedback for us about the use of the tool or any questions that come up around advocacy points, please jump onto the WESROC website and you'll find some contact details there, and you can send through more information to us. So that's an overview of the tool. But as I mentioned earlier on, one of the key contributors to the tool was Associate Professor Sebastian Pfautsch. And obviously really fortunate to have Sebastian joining the session tonight. So this is the point, Sebastian, where I hand over to you.
Thank you, Mark. Here we go. Warami Bajari Nguti to you all out there. It is Daruk for hello and good evening. I'm coming from Daruk country to you, and I'm really very thankful for your interest in the topic broadly, and also for review to give me another opportunity. The coldest day during the year so far. When we talk about urban heat, it's an extremely complex issue that we're trying to address. And that means we need to be very, very clear around practical solutions of what we can actually achieve, what is also out of the achievable. You heard Judith talking about mitigation, so reducing urban heat, but also adapting to it, because we will not be able to change, for example, our 47, 48 or 49 degree heat waves to anything more bearable. We have to learn and adapt to those conditions as best as we can. So tonight I'll have a few slides where I outline practical research that we've done to demonstrate how you can work addressing urban heat at different scales. this is basically a short list of what Judith and Mark also talked about. Just to prep you again, we do have a global trend of rapid urbanization, and urbanization means densification, but also urban expansion, changing from green to gray. That itself produces the urban heat island effect that we know exists in every city. On top of that, we have a warming climate, and that leads together to urban overheating with the very dangerous effects of extreme heat. That is why cities must prepare to handle heat better. At the moment, there is a lot of willingness to do better, but when it comes to the implementation and actual doing better, we're still way behind other countries. I always take Singapore as one example when we look at urban canopy and urban greening, particularly rooftop and vertical greening. They're a decade, maybe even 2 decades ahead of us. So we have a long way to go, and we have to address issues that are outlined in this slide, which lead to greater heat. You may be aware of densification going on in your neighborhood, where you just suddenly see the old corner pub disappearing and multi-level apartment blocks coming up. We also see in Western Sydney, but as Jenny mentioned at the beginning, we see also in many country towns across Australia that urban sprawl, the idea of settlements without greening, with the wrong materials, with very little green space, are actually being built as we speak and have been built for the last 10 years. It's very difficult to actually cool this space because there is barely any space left to implement any of those strategies. So we sometimes also have to think outside the box, and I'll show a few examples of what it means to think outside the box when it comes to trying and mitigate urban heat. The research that we're doing in my team is publicly available. You see reports here that can all be downloaded for free. We're creating these resources either with funding provided to us from government organizations, from private organizations. You can see I work with other universities. We're working at local and also at state government level to get the knowledge out in the community, get it to the industry, and get it to other government organizations to actually start and work along those guidelines that we provide. Every one of those reports has practical research, empirical research in it. What we're trying to really do here is create impact and then allow change to happen that is informed by science. Out of those reports, I'll show some examples that we actually worked on. This was one of the first works that we did in this space. It was called Green Track for Parramatta Light Rail. The Transport for New South Wales organization wanted to have us assessing the feasibility of actually using vegetated light rail tracks for Parramatta. Just a year before, when planning started for the central CBD of Sydney to put a light rail through this area, it was decided against green tracks because someone in Transport for New South Wales decided that plants cannot grow in the deeper canyons. There's not enough light to actually provide green track. If they would have talked to a scientist, we would have probably provided them with a different assessment. In Parramatta, they were interested in what we're thinking of being green track, something that is vital and survivable in a place like Parramatta, where summers can get really, really hot. We did a climate analysis. We looked at where green track around the world occurs in other cities. We looked at the benefits that you get from green track, like noise reduction, different track bed designs with elevated or in-ground track beds. We looked at different species that could be used to actually populate the green track, and of course the water management that is required, particularly during the hotter months of the year. How should we irrigate? What kind of systems are available? And here we are in 2022. The green track is being built. It's the longest green track in Australia, put together in 3 pieces, more than 1 kilometer long, and we have provided more than 13,000 square meters of new green space into the highly dense urban core of the CBD of Parramatta, where of course putting an urban park in that is about the same size that would provide us with cooling benefits is close to be impossible because of the land value and therefore a very low chance to actually provide new green space in a place like the CBD of Parramatta. This green space will absorb rainfall, will provide therefore evaporative cooling, and as I said before, there is additional benefit that will come from noise reduction, but also habitat, some kind of carbon offsetting because we're not using concrete or bitumen to hold the trackbed in place, and so on and so forth. So one way to demonstrate how you can actually bring green space and therefore cooling back into hard space dominated CBDs and other areas. Here's an example from work that we did for Parramatta Council, 2 streets that we compared where street tree canopy cover was very different. In one street, Dakin Street, you can see on the screen at the bottom left, 10% canopy cover. In Galloway Street, which is the image B on the little picture file that you can see on the left-hand side, 30% canopy cover. Across the summer that we assessed, where you had low canopy cover, we have 12 days above 40 degrees air temperature. And in Galloway Street, you have less than half that amount of days, which of course has huge impact on your energy bill, your air conditioning use, but also your personal well-being. We did show with individual measurements of air temperature, comparing the 2 streets, that during heat waves particularly, you can have air temperature differences of up to 8 degrees. It is substantially a different microclimate in a tree-lined street. May not come to a surprise to anyone, but we always need the data to actually make the point about the degree of cooling that you can achieve by introducing a proper street tree canopy. We worked at schools. This was a very interesting project in a public school to demonstrate what we can do to actually reduce heat in schools, which has a massive impact on learning outcomes, because when it is more than 24 degrees in your classroom, you see an exponential decline in the amount of learning that is achieved during those hotter months when you don't have access to air conditioning in your school. Now, to lower classroom temperatures and also to provide just safer areas for play and recreation during lunch break and the morning recess, it is also important that we assess the materials that are used and where they are used and how they are used. In schools, the example on the left shows very hot artificial turf. You can actually see in the lower image, the infrared image, how the radiant heat from that sunlit turf heats up the sidewall of your demountable classroom, which of course is very badly insulated. It is shaded in the upper image. You can see it's shaded, but the radiant heat already heats up the classroom through the wall, and therefore you would have to switch air conditioning on if you have it. Otherwise, you're sitting in very high air temperatures. We also produced air temperature microclimate maps to actually advise management of teachers and educators how they should prevent or encourage play and activities in certain areas of the school when it is really hot in summer, when kids are outside. Because once they play outside in very hot weather, of course, they come back and they need longer time to actually get back to a concentration level where they can take up learning better. So these are examples of how to improve learning outcomes and manage school microclimate. We also managed microclimate and bring it down by more than 45 degrees for surface temperatures is in playgrounds. It's extremely important that we look at playgrounds. They are the places in our densifying cities where kids have contact to nature, where they can have gross motor activities and actually spend time to become more risk aware, to have more and greater physical fitness and mental well-being. So playgrounds, particularly those that you see here, like a neighborhood playground in a small park, they have extremely high value to the local population. You can see what happened in our project from the before to the after picture. We changed surface materials to cooler surfaces. You see there's a new shade structure where we introduced shade strategically with very dense shade to the north and the west, and lighter shade sails to the south and the east, just to combat the UV aspect as well. We also introduced water fountain to keep hydrated, so drinking water, and we planted trees strategically in the north and in the west to, over time, be able to take this modular structure and adjust it to the next playground and provide shade there immediately, while again, the planted trees will grow in and provide natural shade over time. Another example for what can be done in urban environment, hard spaces, we heard it before, car parks can be very hot, the same with roads. Most of them are unshaded. In Western Sydney, we have 6 square kilometers of unshaded black asphalt car parks. So a massive heat sink, which we're trying to cool. In this work, we showed that the cooling effect of applying some reflective paint to roads and car park surfaces can help, particularly at high surface temperatures, reduce these surface temperatures and therefore the radiant heat that comes off them by up to 13 degrees. On average, we achieved about 6 to 7 degrees cooling, but at higher temperatures, you can see it in the graph on the right-hand side, the effect was getting greater, which is of course good news when we look at radiant heat and the additional air heating you get during those heat waves, where surfaces that are unshaded, particularly dark surfaces, can radiate a lot of heat into the environment and add additional heat to air temperatures and bring them up. We also looked at the built environment. This is an infrared shot showing you different roof colors. Some of the roofs, as you can see, black tiles get up to 60 degrees. During air temperature, that is about half of the surface temperature. Once you change the material or even the color, you can see that roof temperatures go down dramatically, which has a massive impact on your energy use for keeping your home cool. The last project that I wanted to introduce is something that I'm currently working on. You can look it up at www.simpact-australia.com. It's a very large project. It's probably Australia's largest smart green infrastructure project that is currently operating in the country. We're working at Sydney Olympic Park to change the irrigation system of the park to something that is responding to climate. And I'll explain that on the next slide a little bit more. We have started the project in 2022 at the beginning of January and have to deliver it within 18 months. We have funding from the New South Wales Digital Restart Fund, also from Sydney Olympic Park Authority and Sydney Water Corporation. We work with UTS and Monash University on this project, and we also have about 12 industry partners that help us. We have more than 260 sensors in the park below ground and above ground that sense soil moisture and air temperature particularly. And we have machine learning algorithms that pick up how irrigation and the climate in the park changes soil moisture. And during summer, we use the system to provide optimal conditions for the trees so that they transpire freely and therefore provide us with the greatest cooling throughout the park. So it's a pure management application to turn the park into the maximum park cool island benefit that we can actually generate by applying water to the park in a way that will help to cool down air temperatures by, we expect, more than 5 degrees. So a really safe place on hot summer days and an absolute heat refuge to the population that is growing at Sydney Olympic Park. They expect about 28,000 people living in high density living. They don't have gardens. They need the park as their local green space. And we're trying to provide this as a future-proof environment for increased urban heat. Take-home messages from me, similar to what Mark was talking about. Urban cooling solutions work at very different scales. I tried to show that working across suburbs, but also, so that's at a meso scale. You work across local government areas or across the whole Sydney Basin. That will be the mega scale. But you can also go down to the micro scale and really change microclimates, for example, in individual streets. Effective approaches need to be implemented at all of those scales. Otherwise, we have no chance to achieve effective urban cooling. Parks are our major assets for cooling cities that we have. We don't need to bring anything new into them. We don't need to plant additional trees, but we need to manage them for cooling. As I explained, there are ways that we're now developing to actually achieve these cool island effects. If we fail to address urban heat, we're definitely risking urban lives. The data speaks for itself. With that, I thank you for listening to us at this late hour. And if there's time for questions, I'm sure that Judith, Mark, and I are happy to try and see if we can answer them. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much for those presentations. I think most of you are probably impressed with both of those presentations. It's really given us a very clear understanding of that high urban heat, and in particular, just looking at both the two presentations, is that it was with the Cool Suburb tool. I find that that's very interesting. In fact, it can be helpful for local councils in evaluating DAs. I also like the idea that you've involved a lot of really important stakeholders in the development of that tool, and so I think it's very innovative and a very exciting thing. So I hope that a lot of people will try it out. And Sebastian, of course, the projects that you've been working on, it's really very positive to see some of those projects in terms of, like, you know, cooling down the roads with that white surface and looking at the roofs and in the suburbs or whatever. So I think we've gained a huge amount of information. So thank you, all of you, for your really innovative and thought-provoking presentations, because it is a very important issue. And it's received very little recognition up until now. So it's really very important. I think you've covered a huge area. So thank you very much. So we are going to go to the Q&A session now. So let's see where we've got some, let's have a look at the questions that we have. We've got a few questions here. So let's go first to Robert. So Robert asked, do planning controls include developer incentives? I provided feedback to my Fairfield Council to allow for a higher FSR, floor space ratio, if developers include options like green roofs, trees, etc. So who would like to answer that? So do the planning controls include developer incentives?
Yeah, I can have a go at that. So I know that some councils do provide incentives to developers. I know Parramatta that does, but I also know that's particularly often it works with your high density development or your city development. So while that can work for some areas, what we're really needing to get to is that some of these issues are mandated to be addressed through through planning controls, and that's where I know that Sebastian's pushing for that. Westrock's definitely pushing for that, to make sure that some of the areas that we've included in our presentation and in, say, Cool Suburbs, that's actually taken up both at state government level, but also at local government level as well. So Westrock developed guidance for councils to address urban heat as part of their planning controls. The good news is that all Sydney Metro councils need to update their planning controls at the moment, and a lot of them, and they have to actually address heat to an extent. So that's where we've provided some guidance in terms of how we think they can best do that, and we have seen some of those controls coming to life. Some of them have been approved now. For example, Cumberland Council and Penrith Council have got quite good controls in their system now, but we also know that there's a long way to go. I also do want to state that, like, while councils can do their bit to an extent, then yes, we can do a lot more. Unfortunately, or I don't know if it's unfortunately, but pretty much half of development in Western Sydney actually bypasses council approval. So what we really need to make sure is that state government and local government regulation is sort of in sync with one another. So state government definitely needs to also ensure that they mandate some of those controls. Again, I don't know if I'm answering your question well. I guess the long and short of it is, I think we do still have a long way to go, but we keep pushing for it. I don't know, Sebastian, I saw you nodding a little bit. I know you've done a little bit in this space. And Western Sydney particularly as well, and with the state government?
Yeah, it would be great to see more incentive programs, particularly around green infrastructure. That's a real problem. And we learn lessons now from Adelaide, where incentive programs are implemented by local governments, also bond programs around trees and construction sites and so on. We're still pushing for these kind of tools to be implemented to help us particularly address, and this also addresses another question that I can see in the Q&A, particularly address the loss of green infrastructure, existing green infrastructure on private land. That's where we see the greatest loss. It's not council, although it's easier to do council bashing, but it's actually happening on private land. It's really important to notify and provide education around the importance of green infrastructure, also for those newly built suburbs. There's also a question that I can see from Mary, where she asks of, we already built Marsden Park and Oran Park and all those suburbs in between. What do we do? It's a really tricky one, because we built them in a way that there's very little capacity to bring back, for example, shading, tree infrastructure. We can change materials, we can change colors, we can change roofs, but that, of course, requires resources, and these resources would be required by private citizens. And most of the citizens out there have invested heavily into their property and the home and don't have the disposable income to just pay another $10,000 or $12,000 to change the roof color. That is just in many cases not possible, and we're talking about hundreds of thousands of homes. So again, incentive programs would be great to have, but at the moment I can only hope that someone finds mechanisms within local and also state government through funding mechanisms to actually then incentivize these changes.
Jenny, could I just provide a little rounding out comment there, which is one of the things we've found is quite instructive is looking around the issue of incentives of the cost of building versus the cost of living. And often we get caught up in the cost of construction or what happens at the time that the building's occurring. Whereas I think, Sebastian gave a great example before of, if you have classrooms where you've got high heat, it creates a poorer learning environment. It's no different than if we're at home. If we're creating a high heat environment, not only does it cost more in terms of energy use, the health impacts are greater. So shifting the narrative and the conversation as well on from cost of construction to the cost of living is, I think, a really important part of it.
And just to that, Mark, we're working with Blacktown and some state government organizations on a very interesting project where we actually ask the question of what's the risk not to do something, because often we forget that that actually makes a complete risk assessment to also ask, what does it mean if you don't do anything? If you don't, for example, provide, in our case, street trees, what does it mean to heating, to health, to active transport, and so on? But I don't want to block. There are lots of questions popping in the Q&A. That's great to see. We may continue going through them.
Here's one from Andrew. Has there been research on what tree species make sense to plant in Western Sydney, or could we end up with a bunch of problematic tree weeds in 20 years' time?
Andrew, great question. I would say, from my perspective of cooling, any tree is better than no tree. So it doesn't really matter if it's a weed tree or not. I want to have as many trees for the cooling aspect. There is a great tool that was just released from Macquarie Uni, Which Plant Where, which has hundreds and hundreds of species. It's a fantastic publicly accessible tool where you can get information about your particular area. So not just is it clay or is it sandstone where you are, but even drill down further where you are in, let's say, any Western Sydney suburb. To get answers around which species should be planted. So I highly recommend you look for the Which Plant Where tool from Macquarie University.
Can I just add to that as well, just following on from what Sebastian's saying? So Westrock's actually working with a section from Western Sydney University as well to actually look at what street tree species are actually quite suitable in terms of future climates as well. Because one thing we need to be quite mindful of is that the trees we're planting now, they won't be sort of big shade giving trees until what is it, 20 years down the track, or a little bit less maybe, but the climate will be changing. So we know that there are tree species that will actually fail at certain temperatures, and they will actually not grow into healthy trees. So one thing we are currently testing with Western Sydney University is looking at what tree species are suitable for that future climate, but also integrating passive irrigation as part of that sort of design to ensure, again, that to make sure that those trees have the best possible opportunity to get to maturity.
Is there anybody would like to add to that answer?
Yeah, I think an important point for me around this is what trees will be most effective at cooling in the future, and just sort of noting the comment there around weed trees, and also the witch plant, where I've always been a big fan of natives because of the biodiversity benefits. But I think if we look in the future, we'll start to ask ourselves the question of which trees are most effective at cooling, which will be linked with irrigation, but also their natural evapotranspiration. So how much water are they releasing to the atmosphere? And we may end up finding that trees that in the past we thought perhaps were the best from a biodiversity perspective, they may actually create greater cooling benefits. And so I think that's going to create some really interesting discussions as we design the green infrastructure of the future, is working out which tree species are actually optimal from a cooling perspective.
Here's one from Stephen. Are councils working on regulations to improve choice of materials? For example, white roofs, not black roofs. And are manufacturers improving materials such as white tarmac?
Yeah, I can pick that one up. As Judith pointed out, in a lot of these developments that we see basically becoming heat sinks. And yes, there was another comment or question around bark mulch. It's also a heat sink, but it's a very bad conductor for heat. So it's not as dangerous as other dark materials. But the issue really around changing how people build their homes, to me, is one around education, to just be informed around the dangers that come with build certain things into your home, or avoiding to have certain things like the roof color. It's a very simple thing. You need a roof anyway. But when you get to the entrance of those new developments and you look at the demonstration suburbs, or where you go and have your house what are they called? Not demonstration suburb. What are they called, Judith? Where do you go when you come to a new suburb and you look?
The display homes.
Yes, thank you very much. So you look at display homes, they show you the black roofs. They have astroturf around them as green infrastructure to keep green and looking good. So you think, that's what I get when I build here. So there's really the wrong impression that is conveyed by just telling people not about the risks when you start to build homes like we see in Western Sydney. So there's a huge piece of work that needs to be done so that when we get to these demonstration homes, we actually start to learn about what is necessary. Build strategically. What about roof color, but also window orientation and size? What about double glazing? We're still allowing, even with the basic system that we have, we're still allowing to have single glazing, which of course allows a lot of heat to get into your home. And then you allow a lot of glass around your northern and western walls. So there are lots of things in the design process where we need to have the consumer really understanding what it means, what they're asking from their designers, as a result, what they have to live with. And that needs to trickle through, because once you get consumers to demand other homes, then we really see the change happening.
And can I just add to that I think, so from the work that we've done and that Sebastian's been doing, I think we do see a change in mindset from some of the consumers. The white roof thing, the black roof thing is definitely getting a lot of traction. Besides sort of educating people on the risk, and I know I've had discussions with Sebastian about this as well. What I think is also really needed is making cool design sexy, and really making it mainstream, and get, say, on the block or whatever, and to have them show cool design, because people don't want to be the odd one out. They will actually want to be part of the pack. So if in the display home all they see is dark roofs and everyone's getting dark roofs, they love dark roofs. So it is also about sort of yeah, it's education, but also making sort of that really mainstream. I think that's my take on it.
All right, here's an anonymous one. Now, Mark, you need to leave soon, and I know that we're just going a bit over time. Now, hang on, someone's just moved it. Oh, hang on. How can we better engage with the community about these impacts of overheating? So especially teaching or having classes dedicated to climate change beginning from primary school. But I think that one about engaging the community about these impacts is an interesting one. So someone would like to address that one?
Well, Jenny, we're here. That's why we have this seminar, right?
Yes,
this is what we do.
right.
This is where we put private time into the public realm to actually spread the word around the dangers that come with urban heat. And there's primary school in there. Well, I can only say we are doing a program where we bring infrared imaging technology into the classroom of year 5 and year 6, have climate change teaching associated with that and quizzes associated with that to see how kids experience urban heat and give them the tools to make science around climate change really interesting, and then analyze. We're just finalizing a paper around that, analyze the data they collect and really look at what is it that the kids learn about heat in their environment. Here in Western Sydney, one of those programs culminated together with National Parks and Wildlife Services in tree planting, because the kids understood that tree shade made their surfaces in the school cooler, and therefore they demanded to get more plant shade, and National Parks and Wildlife Services were part of the program. They provided the plants. That is learned experience, and that will surely influence how these, let's say in 20 years, new homeowners, if they can still afford a home, will actually look at building their homes and making their environment more resilient. So we are addressing that by education, going into school early, using the scientific tools to make them understand what happens in the world around them.
Mm-hmm. Look, we only have a few left, I think. Will the state, this is from Roberts Lee, will the state government, hang on, it's moved, hang on. Well, somebody's already answered that one. By the look, someone's already addressed it. Oh no, will the state government be involved in mandating deep planting areas of new building developments, allowing for large tree planting?
Yes. The short answer here is yes. There are plans within the New South Wales government in the Cooling the Cities unit to actually roll out information how deep soil is provided in various types of environment, from a private dwelling down to heavy industrial complexes. So that is in the making. It will come.
Okay. What other, let's see. This one here from Mary. Why do you think blonde asphalt or bitumen hasn't taken off as the norm for our roadways, especially suburban streets? Mark, would you like to answer that?
Yeah, I can have a go at that. I think it's interesting in South Australia, there's been trials of cool roads for quite a few years, and there's just a really strong element of behaviour change that's going on. Is people, initially their reaction is it's just different and it takes them a while to get used to it. So I think it's just something that we need to persist with. One of the other things we've found in dealing or speaking with manufacturers of road material is that they don't always automatically provide some of this. So it is something that's on the development cycle, but it's not always commonly available, particularly when councils are going out and running procurement processes. It's not always coming forward. So I think there's a combination of people out in the community getting used to it and starting to ask for it, but also manufacturers needing to supply it a little bit more easily.
Mm-hmm. Here's one, which is this. We might make this one of the last ones. How do we? This is from Robert. How do we balance solar panel access with shading benefits?
I can have a go.
Mm-hmm.
They're not mutually exclusive. That is a common wrong understanding of it's either or. You can have a single or even a double-story freestanding dwelling where you plant medium-sized trees that actually just reach, but maturity reach the gutter height. So you shade the sides of your homes, you shade particularly the windows, but you don't shade your roof, and your roof gets the benefits of having PV panels up there and generating some electricity for you. So it's not mutually exclusive. It's a common misunderstanding. It's just a strategic decision that has to be made about which plants or which trees, which type of vegetation should you plant where around your house for various functions.
All right, I think the other ones that are left are really more comments. But in terms of questions, I think that's all the questions that we have. All right, so I can't see any more. I hope I'm not missing any. Yes, as I said, the others are more like comments. So look, we've gone just 5 minutes over time, so that's actually not bad. We were thinking that we wouldn't have time for many questions at all. Look, thank you for all those questions, and thank you for panel asking all those questions for everybody. So look, thank you all for attending. Thank you, of course, to all the speakers, and hopefully you'll join us on another one of these webinars in the future, and hopefully we'll meet you at a branch activity, or more importantly, see you becoming an active member of one of the local branches. So thank you very much, speakers. That was really very informative, and I think everybody has appreciated what they've heard tonight. So thanks for coming, everybody, and see you at another webinar at some stage. Okay, thank you.